And you have asked me, and I did not know what to say. So I just sent you a picture postcard from Waldeck. But I would like to start at the beginning. The truth behind these picture postcards from Waldeck is a journey. It is a journey into the past of my wife's forefathers and the entire Anabaptist context that is part of her. But it is also a journey of my own struggles with what came to me as a kind of new faith, a faith emphasis actually, with a new and different approach to the scriptures and to Christian living in general. It is a journey which began when I met Arlene Most in Costa Rica, a Mennonite missionary with Rosedale Mission from the Grantsville neighborhood, and who then became my wife. In 1967, we were married by her uncle, Ivan Miller, right here in this church. We then returned to Latin America to continue our missionary work. In the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, many of Arlene's forefathers and fellow believers lived in Germany. Originally, they had come from Switzerland, red arrow, and were in fact always referred to as the Swiss. In Germany, many of them had lived in the geographical area where I grew up, namely Waldeck. Again, the red arrow. In the 1700s and 1800s, Waldeck was a small principality, one of the smallest states of the, that's how they called it, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. It was an empire comprised of a loosely knit mosaic of states in the form of duchies, principalities, countships, and kingdoms. There were 3 imperial cities, comparable perhaps to the cities of Washington, later D.C., and Georgetown before 1871. The emperor who ruled this empire lived in Vienna, Austria. Now again, the red arrow. In 1806, he had to abdicate, a consequence of Napoleon's onslaught. In the early 1700s, the tiny state of Waldeck had opened its borders to Anabaptists, to Amish refugees. For many of them, this principality was a last safe haven. But the Amish were capable farmers and craftsmen, and were soon managing large estates all over the area, which in great part belonged to German nobles. And due to quite complicated political, religious, and social conditions, the Amish would not own these estates. Hence, they became leaseholders and administrators, a social status that interestingly often put them above the common local populations. And because of this, and also because of their different faith emphases, that is, the rejection of infant baptism and refusing to be part of the state church, the rejection of military service. Now, otherwise they believe pretty much the same as other Reformation churches. They never became integrated into the local populations and stayed aloof of the surrounding community. And then, in the first part of the 1800s, when most of them left for America, the only tracks left of their presence were local registers where marriages and births had been recorded. Now, this is an original photo from 1850. I don't know whether any of your forefathers came here to America in 1850. They could be on this picture. Occasionally, a local historian would stumble over these records, but rarely come to grips with who and what these Anabaptists actually were. Now, coming up with strange and even funny assumptions, for example, dumping all religious groups that were not part of the state church into the same pot. Now, a religious hodgepodge brewed up by scholars and lay people alike. But in reality, hardly anyone remembered them. Those who taught local history to us never mentioned the Amish. They were forgotten, as if they had never existed. In 1970, on our first furlough for missionary work in Latin America, which in part we spent in my home in Germany, my wife Arlene took me to a mill in Freienhagen, about 12 miles from Flechtdorf. Flechtdorf, that is the name of the town where I grew up. And in this case, instead of me showing her around in my homeland, she began to show me around. And she drew my attention to a history that had been quite unknown to me. I learned that according to a family tradition, one of her forefathers, a Schwarzentruber, had managed this mill, the so-called Untere Mühle in Freienhagen, at the turn of the century, 1800. According to a local register, the last Amish Mennonite who died here in 1828 was the miller Jacob Güngerich. In 1831, his 3 sons, Johannes, Christian, and Daniel, and by then living in Hessen, emigrated to America. It is perhaps correct to say that my journey into Anabaptist history began during this furlough. Later, I also learned why Waldeck had been so important for these Amish Mennonites. And what jumped out at me were 2 reasons. One was the country as such. The second were the emphases of their Anabaptist faith. The Amish people who settled in Waldeck fell in love with a small principality. In a memorandum addressed to the Waldeck government in the first part of the 1800s, the Amish community referred to Waldeck as the soil in which their Ahnen had been laid to rest. Now we are in possession of the entire text of this write-up. And what draws attention is how they referred to their forefathers. They used the German word Ahnen. The more common designation would have been Vorfahren, forefathers, which in effect is the word ordinarily used. But Ahnen means more than Vorfahren. It means forefathers plus giving a sense of rootedness and place. In the memorandum, and this is interesting, there was no reference to old Switzerland beyond the southern borders of Germany. And what I want to say is that this sense of rootedness and place means that to the Amish people who settled in Waldeck, Waldeck was not just a way station, it was more. The John Roth, now we say Roth, who had fled military service in Waldeck in the early 1800s and gradually making his way across the Atlantic, turned up in Holmes County, Ohio, where he was naturalized. He stated that he had come from, now he did not say Germany, or farther back Switzerland. Now he said he had come from the country of Waldeck. And that is, these Amish immigrants had made Waldeck their home. To them, it had turned into a kind of second Switzerland. And looking at these slides, you also understand why. The Amish had no intention to leave Waldeck. They wanted to stay. And this then is also the title of this presentation. We wanted to stay. The second reason why Waldeck is important is faith. In mid-December of 1796, the ministry of the Waldeck and the new Northern Hessian Amish congregation published what has become known as the Waldeck Catechism. The Waldeck Catechism is an extremely important document. In the decades following the 1796 ministry meeting, the catechism was widely used, now always referred to as the Waldeck Catechism, not only in Waldeck and Hessen, but throughout the 1800s and at the beginning of the 20th century in many immigrant congregations in North America. But I would like to talk about that tomorrow. Tonight, I would want to discuss when and how the Amish people first came to Waldeck and the impact they made. But as a matter of fact, we do not exactly know the when and the how. But we do know that in the early 1730s, there were Amish people in southern Waldeck, namely the Files and the Joosts. They lived and worked on the Lichtenfels estates, owned by Baron Ferdinand Ernst von Dalwig. And this is his castle. The records show that these two Amish people had become involved in a legal squabble with the Lutheran Church. Now, at that time, the state law in Waldeck required that all children needed to be baptized. And understandably, the Amish resisted this law. No, neither did they attend the obligatory Lutheran church services. The situation became so tense that Prince Karl August Frederick of Waldeck himself had to intervene, and luckily for the Amish, he ruled in their favor so that they could no longer be harassed by the Lutheran Church. As it appears, now about 4 years later, in 1737, the Lichtenfels Amish received a visit from the neighboring principality of Wittgenstein. Now that is, from the Homrichhausen leaseholder, Hermann Bender. Now there is a quite extensive sketch of the Hermann Bender story in this book, pages 16 to 33, but a detailed account on Bender's stay in Homrichhausen, based on the original Berleburg documents, appeared a few months ago in the April issue of the Mennonite Family History, and is quite different and much more extensive than my brief article in the last issue of the Historian, which most of you have already received. It can be obtained at the Masthof book table in the back of the auditorium. Now, there is a Bender genealogy insert in the picture Postcards from Waldeck book, which goes from this Hermann Bender that I have just mentioned until the Amish Benders here in this area. At that time, the visitor, now Amishman Hermann Bender, was at the point of leaving Homrichhausen in Wittgenstein and enter a new lease agreement in Waldeck. Now, as a matter of fact, Bender and the Lichtenfels Amishmen Pfeil were going to take out the lease together. Now, the large farmstead or estate that was made available to them by the Prince of Waldeck was Billinghausen in the uttermost north of the principality. What draws attention is that Pfeil and Bender were set to make sure that there would be no repeat of the Lichtenfels troubles where they had been harassed by the Lutheran Church. Neither did they want to be disgraced when they passed away. As a matter of fact, they did not sign until the Prince of Waldeck had guaranteed in writing that they would have unrestricted religious liberty. They gave their signature for the lease of Billinghausen on the 22nd of January in 1738. On the 1st of January, the Prince of Waldeck had published his Edict of Toleration. Now, and let's look a little bit closer at this document. The edict reads, after having decided to receive and accept some Swiss Anabaptists, until now leaseholders of Homrichhausen in the Countship of Wittgenstein, for the lease of our Billinghausen estate, and who have most humbly indicated in which way they do not hold to any officially admitted Christian denomination, but rather keep to themselves, and neither have their children baptized, they have most submissively asked that we most graciously deign to grant and allow, before accepting this lease, that they would not again, wieder, be disturbed and hindered in the practice of their faith and holding religious services. Now, wieder, or again, now seems to be a reference to the Lichtenfels troubles, and will not be compelled or bothered to attend state church services or take their children to baptism, and that in the case of death, the deceased be most graciously granted a Christian burial in Wrexham. No, it's a neighboring town. Now, as a rule, the established churches did not allow Anabaptists to be interred in their cemeteries. No, but here, the Prince of Waldeck ruled that the Lutheran cemetery had to be made available to them. Now, the term Christian burial would also mean that the church bells would ring from the steeple of the Lutheran church at Amish funerals. Now we continue reading. This docile petition has been mercifully approved, and the accountability for their faith and religious practice is left to their conscience. We hereby order our consistory most graciously to leave the referred to Swiss unobstructed in their religious freedom. Now, for quite a while, there were Amish people on the Billinghausen estate. Records indicate that Amishman Jacob Oswald leased Billinghausen together with his father-in-law in 1762. He died here in 1787. Amish leaseholders were in Billinghausen at least until the end of the 1700s. In point of fact, the Tolerance Edict of the Prince of Waldeck created a wide open door for other Amish people to immigrate and make Waldeck their home. As you can see on this map, in the following years, Amish people continued to trickle into Waldeck. But as time went on, land for making a living became scarce, so they crossed the border into Hessen. And little by little, neighboring Hessen began to look like Waldeck. The Amish seemed to be everywhere. But we have to return to Lichtenfels. At the bottom of the Castle Mount in Dalwigstal is the Sand estate. Here lived Amishman Samuel Yoder. Now he would become the bishop of the second, the Hessian Amish congregation. In 1804, now by then living in Hessen, now he wrote to relatives in the States, I quote, "We were formerly one congregation in Waldeck, but now so many have moved to Hessen that we have a congregation here also," unquote. He was succeeded by Bishop Samuel Brennemann, 1759 to 1834, also a Hof-Sand resident who later moved to Hessen. The old bishop Samuel Yoder died in 1806 on the Hünninghausen estate in Helsen, close to the capital of Waldeck, that is Arolsen. Now, earlier, that is long before the Amish moved into Waldeck, in the first part of the 1600s, the town of Waldeck and Waldeck Castle had been the cultural and political center of Waldeck. But from 1655 onward, it was Arolsen. So it is not at all surprising that the Hünninghausen leaseholders, namely the Güngerichs, represented the Amish before the Waldeck government. During the noted All-European Amish Conference at Essingen in 1779, Christian Güngerich of Hünninghausen was a representative of the Waldeck Amish. Now, his son Peter's second wife, Catherine, needs to be mentioned. Now, she was an extraordinary woman. She lived a life that exemplified what Anabaptism stood for. Throughout her life, she carried the Amish Anabaptist witness into the surrounding non-Amish communities by humbly and lovingly serving others. A selfless woman who had given her all to help people in need. Deeply involved in charity work, she had won the heart of everyone. We are told that when she died, she had been highly esteemed, greatly loved, and would now be greatly missed by the Amish as well as by many others. Catherine's dedication to the disadvantaged and poor, I would say, epitomized the Amish understanding of mission and the practice of missions. Now, let's just make a little insert. As already mentioned, during the entire time of the Amish presence in Waldeck, it was Arolsen which was the capital of the small principality. The last Amish people leaving Waldeck for America left around the middle of the 19th century. Let us say, I don't know exactly, 1860. Now, roughly 80 years later, Germany and Waldeck had been swept into Nazism. And Arolsen, with Waldeck and its prince, were centers of Nazi ideology. And doubtless, if the Amish would have stayed in Waldeck and elsewhere in Germany up to that time, continued to cling to a non-resistant lifestyle, refused to bear arms, they would have ended up in concentration camps. And after the war, Josias, the hereditary prince of Waldeck and Pyrmont, was sentenced by an American court. Now, let's return to the Güngerichs. Peter Güngerich's second child, Marie, was born in Hünninghausen in 1787. And later on, she married Christian Schanz. In 1790, the couple leased the Luisenmühle or the Galgenmühle close to Mengeringhausen, located about a mile from Arolsen. Now, Mengeringhausen, that is a city with a crooked church steeple. And 2 years ago, in this auditorium, and Leroy Beachy presented his book on the history of the Amish people on both sides of the Atlantic, he asked me whether I remembered the crooked church steeple of Mengeringhausen. Now, quickly answering in the affirmative, I need to apologize. Now, thinking back, I remembered the crooked church steeple faintly or not at all. Now, in spite of the fact that I had driven to Mengeringhausen many a time. A couple of months later, we visited Waldeck again, and I took these pictures. And now, for sure, the crooked steeple of Mengeringhausen has been forever graven in my memory. And so it was with other things. It wasn't only Arlene, but others too, and Leroy Beachy, who taught me anew about my homeland, where I had come from. I have just made mention of Christa and Maria Schanz, who had leased the Luisenmühle in 1790. But the person remembered by family historians in conjunction with the Luisenmühle is above all Bishop Jacob Schwarzentruber, as indicated Now, Peter Güngerich had passed away in 1816. After the death of his second wife, Peter married again, namely Barbara Güngerich, born Esch or Oesch. Barbara bore him 2 sons, Jacob and Daniel. 4 years after her husband's death, that is in 1820, she married Jacob Schwarzentruber. Now we are told that Jacob, a good Anabaptist, cared for his 2 stepsons as if they were his own. A few years later, no, that is 1833, the entire family left for the United States via Bremen and Baltimore. The diary of that trip, written by stepson Daniel Güngerich, has been preserved and has been published repeatedly. In the US, the family lived first in the Glades. Now, let us look here. There is Berlin, Shanksville. Now, this entire area apparently was called Glades. There's even still a place name called Glade. No, this is the Glade Pike, that is still there, and also marked as such. Now then, he moved across the border into Maryland, where Father Jacob built and operated a grist and sawmill. Later he moved to Iowa, where he was ordained bishop. My nephew-in-law, Corby Grebel, he told us about his travels to Iowa several years ago. It was quite challenging and interesting. Now, his sermons, we are told, were thorough and serious, gripping, compelling, and moving. He was a humble and unassuming man, permeated by the love of Christ. Just a little bit ago, I showed you this picture. The entrance to the Waldeck castle at the lower gate. Here in the background to the right is a view of the castle as seen today from the town of Waldeck. With, in the foreground, the widely overgrown backyard of the Hotel Roggenland. In 1760, this was a farming estate, leased by the Amish men Johannes König and Christian Schwarzentruber. And this picture from an old postcard shows the area in the way it may have looked at that particular time. Now, farther down in the valley was another estate managed by Amish people, namely the Warnhagen estate. You see the castle up there on the top. There is no Edersee yet, and down there is the Warnhagen estate. Today the area has been flooded by the Edersee Dam, but sometimes at low water the ruins of Warnhagen can still be seen. In 1780, Amishman Johannes Weary was subleasing Warnhagen, but then he applied to lease the estate himself. It seems that when he applied to lease Warnhagen, he was strongly convinced about his professional capabilities and quite outspoken about them. Not holding back on what might have sounded like boasting, and perhaps desperate to lease the estate, he backed up his application by alleging that, quote, he had made cheese that no one else in the land could make, unquote. This estate was the reason that he would be able to pay a steep lease fee. He was granted the lease. It must have been around the turn of the century, 1800, that his daughter Anna married Peter Schöttler from Giflitz in southeastern Waldeck. At the time, Schöttler was manager of the Mittelhof. Now we will talk about the Mittelhof tomorrow. Later, we find the Schöttlers further east in Harzburg, and then after 1816, they leased Dammersfeld in the Harz Mountains. Now let us look at this map here. Now we have the Principality of Wittgenstein, from which Hermann Bender moved to Waldeck, to southern Waldeck. Now, this here is the shape of Waldeck. They call that the Waldeck Bear. No? The Mittelhof estate, not very far from Waldeck, and this is Dammersfeld in the Harz Mountains. Now, up to them, the Dammersfeld estate had been managed by the Amish Sommer family. Now, this here is the Osterkopf, now with a view towards the Harz Mountains. Now, the Osterkopf in the Upland, the Waldeck Highlands, is close to the Strick estate, which, now, as we remember from a previous picture, Hermann Bender had leased after his stay in Homrichhausen and Billinghausen. And from here, on clear days, the Harz Mountains can be seen in a distance, now roughly 150 miles to the east. As to the Sommers, now they had come to Dammersfeld in 1787, and most likely directly from Switzerland. Before that, Dammersfeld had been a horse farm, but should now be turned into a Swiss dairy estate. And from all I could make out, it seems that the project turned into a smashing success. In his 1806 travel guide, a German author suggested that travelers to the Harz Mountains might want to stop at the Dammersfeld Dairy Estate where, quote, excellent milk and cheese could be purchased. Now, and frequently locals visit the Meierei for the same reason, that is, to purchase milk and cheese. There is a quite particular delicatessen cheese named Harzer. Not too long ago, I read in a quite recently published tourist prospectus on the Harz Mountains about a Swiss farmer who in 1787, that is the date, took over a farm in the Harz. He had the smart idea to inject edible mold into the long-known acid curd cheese originating into what is known today as the true Harzer cheese. Now, the Harzer, the prospectus claims, belongs into the category of low-fat cheeses and may be eaten even while dieting, and then adds, of course, without butter. I said, no, it was the Amish Sommer family who at this date, 1787, established themselves in the Harz Mountains. But others claim that this is only a legend. But what is not a legend is that another visitor who accidentally chanced upon the estate was a student, Christian Wilhelm Spicker, 1780 to 1858. The later Lutheran district superintendent, senior pastor, and professor at the University of Frankfurt an der Oder. At the time, he was studying theology at Halle University. And during the Pentecost holidays of 1800s, together with some fellow students, he had decided to explore the Harz Mountains. On their hike, they lost the way. Instead of continuing straight on to where they would spend the night, the group took a footpath leading to the left into the woods. They ended up at the Dammersfeld Amish Dairy Farm. The Amish Dairy Farm gave them a stormy welcome. They were greeted by a pack of angry dogs, one of which even shredded the coattails of one of them. Now, on reaching the house, they knocked at the door and were immediately asked to come inside. Spicker and his companions took note of the Swiss accent of the family, of the bearded Amishmen, the different way of dress. Now, the students took that for a traditional Swiss costume. The family had gathered for evening prayers, but the students were heartily welcomed. Quickly, one of the ladies set the table and invited them for a snack of milk, bread, butter, and cheese. And while they ate, Father Sommer told them about Switzerland. And while reminiscing, he and his wife appeared to be deeply moved. And Spicker remembered that their host's memories and longings were so vivid that even the students became homesick for Switzerland. And later in the evening, one of the Sommer boys accompanied the travelers to the forest. showing them the way where they would spend the night. Now, Spicker published his encounter with this Amish family repeatedly. The first version of his travelogue appeared in 1803, and after that, again and again throughout his life. The wayward wanderers had been aware that their hosts were Mennonisten. Now that is in this case Amish Mennonites, but one is tempted to ask, had they also been aware of the Anabaptist history, of the harassment and persecution because of their faith, and why so many of them had left Switzerland? Did Spicker, who later also worked as a military chaplain, have an inkling of the non-resistance conviction of this kind and loving Amish family, of their rejection of violence and war and military service? And that this rejection of violence, together with the uncompromising stress on visible Christian discipleship, in contrast to the loose living of so many state church Christians, was the very reason that Anabaptists had been marginalized in their homeland and forced to leave the country. The yearning of their hosts for their Swiss home had touched Spicker. Later travelers and even historians thought and wrote that the Sommers moved away from Dammersfeld in 1816. Now this homesick Swiss family had returned to the Alpine mountains. But the fact is that they emigrated to America. And we know for certain that in 1826, son Peter Sommer was in the Glades. And he then moved on to Canada. Many years later, at the end of his life, Spicker rendered the Dammersfeld incident for the last time. But now half a century had passed, and the story took on an almost novelistic thrust. Spicker becomes the instructor herald. And when he loses his way, he's not accompanied by fellow students, but by his pupils. Now, of course, one wonders why this experience made such a deep and lasting impression on the ongoing pastor, administrator, and university professor. In this report, it does not seem that the family in Dammersfeld talked about spiritual matters at all. But Spicker had a fine sense for disadvantaged religious minorities. In 1809, he published a historical defense of the Jewish people, naming and shaming anti-Semitism right up to the 19th century. Compared with mainline Christians, the Sommers were religious mavericks, but at the same time, there was an unmistakable Christian authenticity about them that did not go unnoticed and could not but make a profound impression on a person as sensitive to spiritual matters and to people of other faith as Christian Wilhelm Spicker. It is possible that Spicker and his companion may have silently prayed along while the Sommers finished the customary Amish evening devotions. But it must not have been taken long for the outsiders to become aware that this family tried to place everything they said and did under the control of God. Now, as in fact Spicker's own New Testament required of every Christian. Do everything you say or do in the name of the Lord Jesus, Colossians 3:17. At Dammersfeld, this was taken literally. After the Sommers had left Dammersfeld, people would long remember the moral uprightness of these Amish Mennonites who, as another traveler wrote, their heart was true and without guile. That was a quote. That is the memorial this Amish family had laid down for themselves and would leave behind in the community. Did Spicker sense that the life of these Amish people was marked by Christian essentials that had largely been lost in the lives of those to whom he himself would minister? Conceivably, what Spicker desired for every Christian was that all of life be permeated by the presence of God, and he would dedicate his life to the communication of that message. Without words, that evening, the Sommers preached a powerful sermon. The Amish had preached that sermon before and were still preaching it, even to such an extent that others were drawn into the orbit of their faith, regardless of what a change of religion entailed, namely harassment, legal action against them, imprisonment with forced labor and persecution. The fact is that Spicker became one of the most important devotional writers of the 19th century. Now, some of his material has been translated into English, and suggests a noteworthy German biographer. It is very likely that it was the indelible impact on his Dammersfeld experience that turned him into the man whose writings would inspire thousands towards a closer walk with God. Now let us look at some of the books that he wrote. Now, meine Reise von Halle nach dem Brocken, my journey from Halle to Mount Brocken, that was in 1803. And then Die glücklichen Kinder, the happy children, 1808. Another one, Father Hellwig, Westfälisches Taschenbuch, Westphalian Pocket Book, 1809, with a reprint of his hiking excursion in the Harz. And then Emiliens Stunden der Andacht, Emily's Hours of Devotion. By 1855, it had run to 7 editions. And then Andachtsbuch für gebildete Christen, Devotional for Educated Christians. By 1867, it had run to 10 editions. Christliche Abendandachten, Christian Evening Devotions, second edition in 1840. And that is Herrn Abendmahl, the Lord's Supper, 6th edition. The 6th edition appeared in 1846. Morgenandachten, Morning Devotion, 1831. And then he had a songbook for schools. By 1828, he had run through 5 editions.